So we've just had a really lovely chat with Patrick Snowball, Chair of AIG UK. It's just a fascinating conversation.
Really good. And I think actually for me, unlike you, I know you've met him and probably have heard a lot of that before. It was my first time hearing that's from him. So really enjoyed it. What were your favourite moments or takeaways?
I think all of it, to be honest. I think everything from how transferable military leadership is into the business world. I think he had some interesting opinions on whether do CEOs actually make good chair.
I know, that was interesting.
And kind of the feedback, the light bulb moment that he had that Colonel Peck told him at the age of 25 and how that stuck with him for the whole of his career. I think there's some really insightful, useful nuggets of advice and information. So yeah, excited to...
I think it'll be a great listen.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Patrick. Thank you for being here. I thought we'd start with the question, what are the 2 or 3 sort of moments over the course of your career that have shaped you as a leader?
I mean, I think that undoubtedly, having spent 20 years in the army, that's what shaped my thinking. Initially, as a troop leader on the streets of Northern Ireland, to commanding troops in Germany, to then going to what they call staff college, which is like the military MBA, which you go at the age of 32. And you spend a year studying how to be a soldier, but listening to a lot of senior people and outside. And that certainly was what shaped me. And certainly, since I left the army, that is what's shaped the way I think. The key thing in the army is how do you make complex things simple, and how do you convince people that they're a good idea and that you're going to lead them in the right direction. And that's exactly the same whether you're in the army or not. And certainly that's what I've used as my philosophy. Keep it simple, but make certain that you actually lead from the front. And it's come on, it's not go on.
I'd be really interested to know what some of the lessons that have been transferable into the business environment, because I imagine the military and the world of business have similarities but are also very, very different.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the first thing is that the military is a way of life, business is a job, and therefore you approach it from a completely different situation. In the military, you're actually part of a family. And so you have very different responsibilities and you have to execute them in a different way. Why
did you decide to leave the army rather than spend your whole career, in the military?
I think there were 3 reasons. The first was that I didn't think that it was an environment in which I wanted to bring up my family, in that it's a very transient life, moving every 2 or 3 years. The second point is that actually... It was almost becoming a bit samey, in that I was I was an armoured soldier in Germany, the height of the Cold War. It was very intense, but I do remember my father looking at a map when he was passing through and saying, goodness, I was looking at that position when I was here in 1947. And it sort of clicked to me that actually we were turning the handle. And if you now reflect back, I didn't see the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but I got out before the Berlin Wall came down, and therefore I was able to re-establish myself in an environment where there was still space for army people coming out. I certainly thought about my family. I thought about the samenism of what we were doing and turning the handle, and I guess understanding what it was going to mean to me to become, I don't know, the chief of the general staff or whatever. But then the third point was actually the whole challenge and excitement of a bigger world and business life. And having been very lucky to have gone to Oxford and read history, economics, I guess I was sort of intellectually curious about what happened in the world and kind of felt that actually I could probably do some of that myself. So that was really why I took the decision to go.
Did it feel risky at that time? Making that decision to leave and go into the corporate world?
Gosh, yes. It's one of the three biggest risks I ever took. I was leaving a successful career and going into a world that I didn't really know very much about. I mean, I was fortunate in that about 18 months before I left the army, I was offered a job. And they said that the job is open when you want to come. And the critical tipping point was my 37th birthday, which is when you actually got a pension from the army. and they kept the job open for me. So I wasn't actually just jumping into a cold pond with nowhere to go. I had somewhere to land. There are two people who've really influenced my life since I left the army. And one of them was actually related by marriage to me. And he was very keen that I should go and work for him. And it was quite an amusing story because I said, but Michael, we don't actually really like each other. And he said, no, that's why this will be a huge success. And so I went to work for a service company called Ajax that provided engineering risks into Lloyd's and inspected boilers, lifts and cranes. And it was completely different to what I'd ever done. And the reason it was so important to me that someone like Michael would sponsor me, and is very much a challenge for someone leaving the military, is that I knew how to lead, I knew how to think, but I didn't understand a balance sheet. I'd never had to worry about a balance sheet. I'm not an accountant. And he gave me the space to learn. And within a year, he'd actually sold the company to Norwich Union. And within a year of that, Norwich Union then asked me to take over as the managing director of the company. So he was very influential, but I had to work very quickly. And if you were to say what was probably the key to my success, it was actually eating a lot of humble pie to start with. Okay. People have a very clear view in their own mind about what an army officer is about, and it's completely wrong. But you have to overcome that. And the important thing is to be humble, to eat humble pie, and to listen to people, and then slowly gain their confidence. So what did I know about insurance? Nothing. What did I know about insuring lifts, boilers, and cranes? Nothing. But one of the things the army really taught you about was to be a very good team player and to be a conductor of an orchestra. And so what do I mean by that? So in the army, if you're laying down a bridge at night, well, I don't know how to lay a bridge, but I know a man who can. And if you need an artillery plan to support that, I know a man who can. Mm-hmm. So you have to be able to clearly tell people what you want to do. And then you have to trust them to do their job properly. And so as you get into that environment, you start to understand how to conduct an orchestra in an insurance company that has engineering risks. Mm-hmm. So you listen to the specialist underwriter. You listen to the specialist who tells you that crane's going to fall over if you do. And that's the way that you take the skills from the army and you bring it in. So all the way through, you are a conductor of the orchestra, but it's very important that you are conducting the orchestra and the orchestra is not playing its own tune. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the key.
Mm-hmm. And you said that was the first of your three biggest risky moves or periods that paid off.
Well, yes. I mean, there was an earlier one when I left Aviva and I was offered a job somewhere. And in all honesty, it was a mistake to have taken that job. I got that one wrong. But then I think that another huge risk was that at, I think, 9 weeks' notice, I moved to Australia, a country I'd never visited, to run a company I'd never heard of that included a bank that I'd never run, and with 14,600 people, none of whom I knew. So I consider that to be pretty high risk as well.
I'm interested in in hindsight, the role, because a lot of our listeners will be, thinking about, stage managing their career and sort of thinking about the next move after the next move. What was it about that role when you left Norwich Union, you went somewhere you knew quite quickly that it wasn't right? What were, with hindsight, what were some of the red flags that maybe you were subconsciously aware of?
I think the first red flag was the environment in which I left Aviva.
Okay.
I think it would be recognised now that I was probably the person who was most likely to become the chief executive way back. But I did not get that job. And if you become number two or second in the race, you kind of have to make a decision, I'm going to go somewhere else. So my big mistake was that I kind of panicked.
Right.
And I thought, I'm getting on in age, I need to find a job. And in all honesty, I wasn't particularly proud of myself at the time. You know, my self-esteem had taken a bit of a hit. And certainly I should have been much more reflective about my next job. I should have paced myself more, and I shouldn't have tried to jump on the first train passing the station, which is what I did. And certainly, you know, it didn't take me long to realize that for a whole variety of reasons, nothing to say to the company I joined, but I was in the wrong place doing the wrong job. But again, you know, when the next opportunity came, it came even more quickly. But I knew by then I was in the wrong place.
Okay.
And at that, when the invitation to go to Australia came, it was my big itch to scratch, which was I wanted to run a big public company, but I hadn't anticipated running in the country I'd never been to.
We speak to quite a few leaders, and I think, you know, in some degree or another, there is always an element of self-doubt at points in their career, or if voicing an opinion or a strategy plan. How do you mitigate self-doubt?
So I think an element of self-doubt is really important. If you don't have self-doubt, I think you become very arrogant and you stop listening. But I think that at some stage you have to sort of decide, this is what I'm going to get on and do. And certainly there've been times when I have worried about how I'm going to do something, and quite frankly worried about, you know, can I do it? And certainly, you know, moving to Norwich Union after 3 years running Ajax, where it was a brilliant little company. I mean, it was very, I mean, we made about 15 million a year by the time I left. But it was a brilliant starting ground, because I understood at the end of the day, you know, what it cost to put a waste paper basket on the ground. I mean, I went back to basics, but with a really good finance person supporting me, great operational people. So I really learnt that. And so the self-doubt really was much more about, you know, the culture of the environment I was going into. Was this something where I was not going to have my own orchestra? I was going to be part of a wider orchestra. As someone once said, you know, is Patrick a great leader? And they said probably best when he's leading. And you know, that's something I've always had to be aware of. But certainly moving into that environment, and things moved very, very quickly in Norwich Union. I'd always had this aim to be on the board of a PLC within 10 years of leaving the army. And I just about made that in 11, I think. And so during that period, I had to move very quickly into a lot of different environments at Norwich Union, none of which were familiar to me.
Okay.
And each time having to learn to work with very different people who had a very different view of the world to perhaps I did.
Do you think that breadth is what has given you that confidence, that courage? Because we talk a lot about don't necessarily just consider vertical career progression, think about horizontal progression, and that variety and that breadth and that depth of working in, you know, putting yourself in different environments. How's that prepared you for, or given you the confidence for the future roles that you've had? Yeah,
look, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And certainly when I think of the first 2 jobs I had in Norwich Union up in Norwich, when we were demutualising, and of course that culturally was a massive thing for the company and all the people who worked in it, because of course moving from a mutual environment to one where you had shareholders required a massive rethink. The big step change was that when this wonderful man called Albert Mills, who was the second person in my life who's really influenced my thinking, he retired. I went head to head, and this time I got the job as running the whole general insurance side of Norwich Union, and went on the board. And that was a huge moment. But it lasted about 6 months, because if you look at the history of that time, there was a huge amount of change going on in the insurance industry. So suddenly we were commercial union. I'd acquired London and Edinburgh, we were Norwich Union, and we were General Accident. And we had all these companies with all these different cultures swilling around. And I was forced off the board, well, selected off the board because that's what happens in these things. And that was a huge shake-up to me. But to your point about self-confidence, but I then said, but I want you to bring all these general insurance businesses together. And that was a massive challenge, and certainly one where I thought, gosh, am I up to that? This is absolutely enormous. I can't remember how many thousand people. It was enormous at the time.
Yeah, I'm interested how you led through that, because that's, you know, there's elements of turnaround, of change, of transformation. I'm interested in how you led through that time.
We took the decision that we would integrate the senior management team on the basis that we were going to treat it as a takeover, and that we weren't going to look at what was best practice or what could we do. We were going to look at what do we have in the stocks and what can we use. So what ICT system works now, use it. Which is the best motor policy, use it. And I mean, regulation has changed a lot since then. I don't think we get away with that now, but we basically chose one of everything. The brand was Norwich Union, and we set off. And I think the most important aspect of that, as I said, that within 6 months, everybody in this company needs to know what their job is, if they've got a job, and how we're going to run the business. And that's how we set about it. So it had to be very clear, and you had to take the team on, and I had to clear with the board to say, this is the way I'm going to do it, because these people have been waiting for 18 months and they still don't know what they're doing, and we need to do this quickly. And so it was pretty tough. And I had some very good people who came from the CGU as well, but we put the team together and we made it work.
How did that affect you personally? Because that's a very high pressure, high stress. You've got people's lives in your hands there. How did that affect you, impact you personally as a leader?
When I first looked at it, I'd had the disappointment of not being I knew I wasn't going to get on the board. But then the complexity of all these systems, all these people. I remember going into one office to look at the backlog, and there was this person in Newcastle, and I promise you, she was standing next to a pile of files that were taller than her, and this was her backlog. And it was just, you know, there was that moment of, hang on a minute, I've come off the board, my feelings are hurt. Is this something I really want to do, or do I go and do something else? And I remember going to see this gentleman, Albert Mills, and taking his advice. And he said, yeah, you can do this, you know. And
what was that advice?
Well, I think the advice was to have confidence in yourself. And, you know, clarity, simplicity, and ruthless execution are the way that you get through these things. Now, the Australians never liked the word ruthless. They like the word relentless. I said, I don't mind which it is, but we've got to do the job. But it is clarity. What are you going to do? Simplicity in the way you explain it, and then do it. And as long as you do that, then people might not like it, but they will respect you for the way that you're communicating and the fact you're leading it.
So looking back over the course of your career, have there been any failures, and if so, how have you overcome them?
I don't know how long you've got. I mean, you know, in the X years I've worked outside of the army, or there've been a lot of failures. The one I always point to, and the one that actually was the biggest learning thing for me, was one which became known as the Five Lakes incident. And it's actually, there's a paper being written at INSEAD about this.
Wow.
And the reason, what happened was that so when we brought these four companies together, we had to think about the purpose and the direction and kind of what we were going to do with this train set. And I remember I talked to people about, as far as I remember, it was sort of, you know, we were a service provider, we had insurance at the core, we had care at the heart. This is what we were going to be. And so we called, once we decided who the top 130 people were going to be, who were the next level of direct reports, we went to this place called Five Lakes, which I think is somewhere in Essex. And we talked about how we were going to bring the company together. And then two of us, there was a lady called Bridget McIntyre, who was the marketing director at the time, and myself. And we stood up and said, and so this is what we're going to be. And I remember this guy, and I remember so well, stood up and said, hang on a minute, don't we get a say in that? Is that what we think? And I suddenly realized, and I suddenly heard this rumbling of 130 people saying, don't tell us how we're going to run this company like that. Yeah. And it was real pushback. And it was a bloody hell, now what do we do? And it was a really good moment. And I remember we paused the meeting. And the team of, I don't know, we were still quite a big team because I hadn't quite whittled it down, the top team, went next door and said, well, actually, they're right. What are we going to do? And we went back in and I said, mea culpa, you are absolutely right. I mean, in principle, this is what we want to do. But I think we need to now work out with all of you what that means and how we're going to implement it. And that started off a huge amount of work. And I was very lucky because I had this mentor who was a professor of ethics at INSEAD. And I'd known him for many years. And I went to see him and I said, look, we have this issue. We're going to need a lot of third-party help. And we very much integrated ourselves into INSEAD during this. And we ended up with teams of people working about, well, so what do you mean about care? What do you mean about, a service provider? What does that actually mean? And how do you bring it together? So the vision never changed, but how we implemented it became part of a buy-in of 130 people. And some of the most successful meetings we ever had, those 130 used to meet at INSEAD every 6 months thereafter, as we progressed down there. And it was always known as the Five Lakes incident. But it was probably the most compelling moment in my career where I suddenly realized that I'd got something really wrong, but we could make a virtue out of my rather arrogant mistake.
Yeah.
So that was very important.
What have you learned from that? How's that impacted the way that you go about leading, the businesses that you'd run subsequently? How did that change your leadership style?
I guess it was just another experience to realize that when you've got very complicated organizations and you're trying to bring a disparate group of people together to do something differently to what they've done, that actually you have to take them on the journey. You can't just say, that's the hill, so take it. And the answer is that learning was absolutely fundamental to the way I set up and ran Suncorp in Australia.
Okay.
And we had exactly the same issue in that we had a disparate range of companies. We had a bank, we had life insurance, we had commercial insurance, we had a New Zealand business. I had to try and bring them all together. And I remember one night I was talking to someone and they said, the trouble is, Patrick, this company is many companies and many brands. And he turned around and said, what you've got to do is to make it one company and many brands. Now, having learned from the Five Lakes, he and I then sat down. He'd actually come from the UK for 3 weeks to help me put this all together. And he said, this is another Five Lakes moment. So where you have to actually take that and then construct it and sort of work out as you put your team together how you're going to get buy-in to that. And actually, it was really interesting that all those lessons meant that I kind of saw some of the pitfalls. And bearing in mind that I was operating in a completely different cultural environment. And so actually proving that was not the way I was going to go about it, was the way that we then actually made this company something that really was world-class by the time I left 6 years later.
Correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like a very careful and considered move to leave Norwich, move to Australia. You don't hear about that move sort of too often.
Well, I think the first thing is just to remind you that I was somewhere else.
Okay.
And it was an environment that I wasn't at all comfortable in. But the fact that the job sort of came completely left field.
How did that come about?
I was actually asked to act as a referee for someone who was going to do the job. And the discussion eventually over a couple of weeks ended up with them saying that it was actually me they wanted to do the job, and I hadn't realized because didn't think I'd been approached. But at that age, I thought, well, I've got one more dice to roll as an executive, and if I get it wrong, I'll just come home. But it turned out to be the high point of my executive career, in that all the things you talk about bringing complex companies together, that you are trying to get different businesses to work together, because the company was in a bit of a mess. And you therefore had a way of articulating to people, this is what we're going to do. I mean, I got to a point about 2.5, 3 years down the track when I thought we got all the bits in place, and I did at a meeting eventually say, that's the hill, there's the flag, that's where I'm going, and if you don't like it, then I suggest you better go somewhere else. But by then I had a huge amount of confidence that I had the majority of people in place. And it was a huge pleasure when you started to see how your engagement scores, your enablement scores really started to move. And bear in mind that 50% of the people who worked in Suncorp, at least one of their parents hadn't even been born in Australia. So the cultures are huge and different. And to work that, to bring it together, was a huge pleasure. And it worked. And it was a great end to my executive career.
And before we get to the end of your executive career, I'm just the one thing I picked up there. What gave you because you talked about one last roll of the dice, and if it doesn't work, I should come back to the UK. But what gave you the confidence, the courage in yourself, in your experience, to say, no, I can go and do that role, and I am going to go and take that risk and do it?
I remember I was actually on the board of a big international broker at the time, and there were 2 or 3 very, very experienced people on it, including a wonderful man called Rodney Leach, who sadly died, and he was the consigliere for the Jardine Matheson family group, and I tried it out at a board dinner, and they said, well, we're not certain we want you to be going there. But I remember him saying to me, Patrick, you have to do that. You've got all the components. You know how to do it. I mean, it is a huge risk. And I thought, no, I'll back myself on this one.
Okay.
And particularly having been through all the complex changes in the UK. And of course, luckily, when I was running Aviva or Norwich Union UK, I also looked after the Canadian business, the Irish business, the Asian business. So I understood a lot about international business as well, and the different cultures. So that really helped as well.
Looking back on, taking it right back to sort of almost childhood and the influences there, what have been the childhood influences that have shaped your values that are now and shaped also your leadership style?
You tend to sort of reflect the environment you were brought up in. Had a very lucky family life. My father had fought in the war. He was still a soldier. He was the most enchanting man. He had very high standards, high values. I don't think he was ever very overly, hugely ambitious in the way that perhaps I became in time. But he was a wonderful role model. And I think the important thing is that the army that I joined, everybody from the rank of full colonel and above had fought in the Second World War. So when you were listening to these people, they were actually talking about realistically what they'd done. And when you went some places in Germany or in Normandy, they would say, and this is where I was, and this is where they fired upon. And, you listen to people who had learned in a very difficult environment how to lead and survive or fail. And so you came in hugely respectful of the people, because they were teaching you an art that they had experienced firsthand, and they were trying to relay that to you. And that's very different to being in a business. I always say the difference in the business is that if you give an order in the army and you get it wrong, someone's going to get killed. That's not going to happen in business. And so when you listen to these people and you took on board what they were saying, they might not have been very impressive people, but they knew what they were talking about and made you hugely respectful. I mean, I'd also add, of course, that virtually every senior politician had also fought in the Second World War, whether it was the Dennis Healeys of this world or the Ted Heaths of this world. So when they were committing us to do something, they actually knew what it looked like when someone got killed at the end of that commitment. And I think one of the worst things that's happened, of course, is that from the Blair years forward, people have started to commit people without actually understanding what it means once you've committed people. But certainly, I learned a huge amount from that. And that took me into the military, where I was comfortable to learn. And then really, as I left the military, I started kind of understood what things I needed to take with me and being genuine. And I think the most important thing, as I've always said, is come on, don't go on at the end of it.
And then you mentioned your father not being particularly ambitious, but or not to the same extent as you. Had you been, when you left the army into business, at that point in time, did you see that you'd want to go all the way in your career and lead a business, or did that kind of momentum build? And
No. I mean, one of the sort of third reason that when I left the army is that I did have ambitions to be successful.
Yeah.
And I set myself some goals and I set to achieve them. And certainly, it was certainly not just moving sideways from the military and continuing at that tempo. Taking that risk and risking it for my family as well was part of the fact that if I go, I'm going for broke.
Yeah.
I'm going to the top.
And was that innate, or where did that sort of drive come from, do you think?
No, I mean, I was talking to someone this morning when I was about this interview. I said, I don't think really I changed gear till I was about 25. I think until I was 25, whether I was at university or early in the military, I kind of coasted. And I remember just being taken aside by this colonel when we were on some course somewhere, and we were talking about dispositions. And this guy had commanded a tank squadron in Normandy in 1944.
Wow.
And he pulled me aside, and I know exactly what he was absolutely right. He pulled me aside and said, "Patrick, you're part of a very professional regiment. I just hope you're not going to let them down." And I remember going, wow, that is such an important thing that he's just said. And that's what changed me completely. I thought, he's right. I'm coasting. I got through Oxford without really breaking into a sweat. I'd done my first bit of the military career. But that was when I was about 25, 26, and I suddenly thought, wow, he's absolutely right. And it just changed my entire attitude to the way I conducted myself and conducted myself amongst other people.
Amazing how that bit of feedback early in your career really kind of
pretty brutal.
but equally impactful and
totally
yeah. And what crystallized in your head? What was the light bulb? That was the light. That was completely the light bulb moment, because in that moment I then reflected on how I'd got myself to where I got to. And it was kind of the sort of thing as, actually, it's not very cool to pretend to work. You want to be relaxed. I was just going along in the flow amongst a lot of like-minded folk. And so, even by the time you're 25 in the army, if you start to, as it were, engage gear, then that's when you start to differentiate yourself and you get yourself into the top third and you go on. But it was that moment where you just said, that's a great regiment. I hope you're not going to let them down. And it was an incredible, probably the pivotal thing that was ever said to me. And what was the practical consequences of that? Was that just you working harder, studying harder, asking more questions. What was the practical implication of that light bulb moment in behaviour?
The way I describe it, which people in modern management understand, that was when I started to lean in from having been leaning out.
Right. Okay.
That's the way I describe it. That actually I decided, no, I'm going to lead this. I'm going to push myself forward. It may not be popular all the time, but I want to be taken seriously. And this guy is basically saying to me, we don't take you seriously because we don't think you're trying. Yeah. And I don't think that accusation's ever been raised to me ever again. But it was absolutely incredible. Just remember it so well.
Wow.
Working with leaders who were leaders in the Second World War, that commander who had been at Dunkirk, and seeing those leaders now versus the leaders that you're mixing with today, have the qualities of a leader changed, or do you think the essence of the leader is going to be, is always the same, albeit, a few adaptations along the way?
The ingredients of leadership fundamentally is being someone who's genuine. Mm. And when that person talks, people actually think that person is genuine. They have a set of beliefs and they're prepared to execute them. Mm-hmm. And I think that bit has not changed. I think it's, if you look at the political class, I think it's missing completely now.
Yes.
But I think in business, you still see that. I think that the big difference is the way people communicate now. And now that I'm a chairman of a company rather than being a chief executive, I look back and think, gosh, how much of what I did could I do now? And how differently would I have to do it? And I think that the openness that you're required to have now, which is very much a double-edged sword, is something that I would have found quite hard, because I've tended not to wear whatever it is on my sleeve, on my heart on my sleeve too much. But fundamentally, it is about being a genuine person and being able to communicate to people. I said, to get on the bonnet of a Jeep and say, that's where we're going, and I'm going first. And it doesn't matter what world you're in now, if you give people the confidence, they will also take the risk as well.
That's so interesting. And how do you think your leadership, how have you had to adapt your leadership style from executive to non-executive? What's the difference there?
I think I have a theory that actually successful chief executives find it much harder to be successful chairman.
Interesting.
I look at the way that some of these senior partners from the audit firms, the law firms, people like that, even the people who've been CFOs, are so successful as being chairman of big companies. And time after time, I look at chief executives who find it much more difficult. And that's because it's a completely different style.
Yeah.
I think that, I chaired 2 IPOs. I chaired a secondary bank, and now I chair AIG's UK operations, which is not, therefore, a public company. And I think that in each of those, I was relatively successful because each of them actually required quite an executive chairman. Mm. When you're doing an IPO, you're the one who actually signs a bit of paper at the end of it. Yeah. And you're taking a management team through something into a world that you've been to and they haven't. But I think that as you move through that, it is hard because you've seen how mistakes are made in these environments, and there are times when you want to jump in. We had a hostile bid at the bank that I was chairing, and I remember taking advice from another chairman. And I said, how near do I get my hands to the steering wheel now? And he said, you take the steering wheel. Because once you get into that environment, the chairman's role is to actually drive the company because it's going to survive or fail as a result of you and the board. And I would say that I was a much more successful chief executive than I have been a chairman. I think I've chaired companies successfully, but I think that's because I've always found it harder to keep my hand off the steering wheel, which is, I think, genuinely what most chief executives are going to find. I'm sure that's very controversial. I'm sure they put
No,
it
we
makes
like
total
controversial.
sense.
But
But actually, I think is also quite, others share that sentiment. It
Yeah.
is. It's certainly a learning, I think, to have to sit on your hands rather
yeah.
than take the steering wheel.
Yeah.
I think it's a really valuable point, but I think it's easy to say and less to actually sort of follow through with, because I think a lot of companies take comfort from the fact that somebody's been the CEO rather than actually thinking about what the transferable skills are.
Yeah. And I think that, you used that word transferable skills. I think that the transferable skills of someone who's been a senior partner in an accounting firm are really important because of the duties of a chairman. I find that the board is responsible for the culture of the business, but the culture of the business really is executed through the chief executive. So the role of the board is to make certain that you're comfortable with the way the chief executive is behaving and imposing, but not to get between him and the company. And I think that there's more of a danger of that once you've been a chief executive than if you've been a senior partner and they are very successful. I've watched some of these people, senior servants. They're very, very successful, very erudite people. And I would find it hugely frustrating to have ever done that. But again, if you were to say, what's my style now? My style is completely what I would call reflective now, in that I chair one company. It's a subsidiary of an international company. My responsibility is to make certain that that company is a good, responsible citizen of the United Kingdom and meets its obligations there. And I have an obligation to a shareholder. That's very different to chairing a public company, or indeed being the chief executive. And so you just have to understand how these things can be.
Yeah. What advice would you give your younger self, or for those 20-somethings in the market today that do have aspirations, ambitions to be a chairman, a group CEO, CFO, CXO?
I think the ability to eat humble pie, very important. I think, if I was to look back on my career, I would like to have been less defensive than I have been, I think, all the way through. I think that there have been times when my defensiveness has probably just irritated people and really not achieved anything. But you have to be really big sometimes not to get defensive. And I think that would be the failing that I would put at my feet. I think that at times I've been more defensive than I needed to be. And I think that if I had accepted other people's input, things would have been much better. I just remember, I remember in Northern Ireland, we were doing something a bit complicated. And I remember the person saying, why, Patrick, stop, why didn't you do that this way? And I knew he was right, but I actually said no. And actually, we made a bit of a mess of it because we said no. And it was just a lesson. And I would I wish I could say I never made the same mistake again, but I know I have done over different times where I've just become defensive when it was not needed. So listening to others, being more open. But I think the other key thing about it is you have to enjoy what you're doing. I hope in this interview you've understood the level of enthusiasm I still have for 100%. The things I've done and the way my life has panned out. And that energy and enthusiasm is a very important part of convincing people that they should follow you.
Yeah.
Being genuine as well is fundamental.
Well, you have to have that enthusiasm, I reckon, to be genuine to get people to follow you.
And you're right. And you see companies where it's just not being run by people who actually understand other people, how they work. I think this balance, which we haven't talked about, was between EQ and IQ is so important. And I certainly think that the most successful people are the people somewhere in the middle between the two of those. and these really super bright IQ people. It doesn't matter, but I mean, when you look at people like Zuckerman, massive, and when you're running big companies, a public company like that, getting that balance between EQ and IQ is really, really important. And I think that you can see it so quickly when it's not there. And
Totally, yeah.
And you then see how these businesses become dysfunctional because people at either one end or the other just don't have confidence because they're the diametrically opposite.
Yeah.
And this confidence is so important.
Thank you very much. And question we often end on is, are you, if you're going into a boardroom, and is there a song that you ever, a go-to song to sort of get you in the mood and fire you up to talk to
I
all
think
those
the cynic would say things can only get better. I think it's funny enough. It's one of those things which is really important. Is when you go into a meeting or a board meeting, your body language is so important, and so you need to bounce in, unless you really are very angry. But it is again setting that environment of how you feel.
Yeah.
So I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah.
It is very important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.